Well, Madeline, thank you so much for joining me. I've been very eager for this interview. You're my last author interview for this season of the Best of Women's Fiction podcast, but your book, The Librarian Spy, a national bestseller, came out back in July. So I've had a long time to anticipate this chat with you.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for having me here today, too. I really appreciate it.
Well, I don't want to waste any time. In case there are listeners out there who haven't yet read your book, let's start, if you would, by telling our listeners what The Librarian Spy is about.
So basically, sort of like my inspiration for it is the American librarians that were sent over to neutral countries to gather intelligence through like foreign publications, clandestine presses, magazines, pamphlets, whatever they could get their hands on. And so we have sort of our intrepid spy that's gone over and doesn't really know what she's doing. And she's sort of run all these other consummate spies. And then in Lisbon, in Lyon, France, we have a woman who's with the French Resistance working with those presses, and she actually makes those newspapers with the secret messages in them. So it's that's sort of how the story developed.
Well, this is your second historical fiction novel, but you've also written 8 historical romance series and 3 standalone novels, totaling over 30 books. Honestly, I lost count when I was counting all of your book covers on your website.
Yeah.
Which I think makes you the most prolific writer I've had the opportunity to interview on this podcast.
Oh, well, thank you.
What drew you to write in the historical fiction genre, especially after writing so long in the historical romance genre?
You know, when I was writing historical romance initially, like I started in the 1600s, and then I thought, oh, the medieval times it's so interesting. So I started to research the medieval life, and I spent about a year researching that, and then I wrote a whole bunch of medievals. And then I thought, oh, Regency is so interesting. So I started to research that. And then I decided, you know, I've always really been fascinated by World War II. And so I decided 2020 was the year that I was going to write a World War II historical fiction novel. So that gave me a whole new genre to really kind of dip my feet into. And I realized in researching The Last Bookshop in London, which was my first historical fiction, I really just love the research aspect of writing historical fiction. And I think that's really what got me into writing, even with historical romance. And so now, like, it's wonderful. Like this book that I'm working on right now, I basically have spent 10 months completely immersed in tons of research. And then, you know, write the book after the fact. So really at the end of it, it's research. I love it.
How do you approach a novel differently depending on the genre, if it's historical fiction or historical romance? Or
Historical romance, I feel like I already have a pretty strong foundational knowledge for that time period. So you really just kind of need to have like something that you can incorporate into a plot thread that may have something to do with the politics going on, or even like a clan war or something if it's Scottish, like that. But as far as historical fiction goes, I feel like the historical research for that, the history is almost like a character in and of itself, because you have to be so in depth with it, not just all of the events that really happen, which ultimately really help develop your entire plot, but also just all those little nuanceical details. I really love to hear about how people lived during that time period, what they wore, what they ate, what their lipstick colors were, all of it. And so really, I feel like all of that really comes together and to make that whole picture when it comes to historical fiction.
Well, all of your books are historical, whether historical fiction or historical romance. So what is it that you like writing about history as opposed to contemporary novels? And would you ever write a contemporary novel?
That's a really good question. You know, I was thinking about possibly dipping my toes in contemporary, because I will say that this was the very first time that I've taken like 10 months off of writing, and probably the last, I guess, 15 years that I have been writing, so that I could just do only research and write. And when I started writing again, I felt a little rusty. So I actually thought, well, maybe I'll start working on a contemporary piece. So I might be like running around bumping into walls for a while with that. But you know, just to kind of keep my like sort of creative juices kind of flowing. But as far as Oh gosh, now I forgot the first part of the question. I'm so sorry.
Okay, that's okay. What is it that you like writing about with history?
Oh, okay. Thank you. It really just is, it's like learning how people worked around things. It's learning how things got started. It's just like for example, in the Librarian Spy, with Elaine, she's using that pump press, like that, the way that the printing press is, it's manually operated. You don't plug it in. It has this treadle that you press on the ground, and it has this sort of contraption that comes up, and you have to swap out the paper to be pressed, and then you take it off and you put a new one on, and then it comes up again. And that's just amazing to me that like the details of that kind of thing. And I actually got to see the printing press that the woman who inspired Elaine's character actually used during World War II when I went to the Resistance Museum in Lyon.
Oh, that is a great segue to my next question. Your bio mentions that you are a diehard history lover who will happily lose herself in research any day. And I also love the research process of writing. It is my favorite part of the writing process, and I could probably just research forever and never actually write a book. Would you say research is your favorite step in the novel writing process?
Absolutely, 100%. I think, and the funny thing is, like, I'm kind of wrapping up my book right now, and I'm like, I wish that I had 5 years and like 3 books to fill this with, because I'm just enjoying the research aspect of it so much that I don't really want to stop. And I also have like about 15 spiral notebooks that are completely filled with handwritten notes from all of the research that I've done. And trying to pick and choose what things I'm putting in my book, I see you noting. It's so hard because you want to put everything in, but that would be a really long book, and I think my editor would really red pen that one to death. But it's so tempting.
Generally speaking, what does your research process look like from the initial spark of inspiration to writing the novel?
The initial spark, I have to be careful from getting too excited and going too crazy, because we do have to make sure that we get approval from the editors to go on forward. And I have had it before where I've gotten all excited and I bought all these books, and they're like, well, that's not really something that we think is going to be as viable. And then you're like heartbroken and you have all these books. I mean, not that they're ever wasted, because you never know when you're going to bring them up for some other story again. But so, once I get the go ahead, like with this last one, I purchased like dozens of books over the course. I went like on this full shopping spree of books, because now I had carte blanche to just go crazy with it. My poor mail woman was coming here, and she actually, instead of putting it in the mailbox, she actually brought boxes to my door. So, and then I get those and I start going through the bibliography and I start plucking out all of these other ones. And if you can't find it anywhere, you go to Abe Books and you can find these old used books that haven't been in print for like 50 years. I mean, it's just, and then you just dig in. And it's so funny too, because every time I get a new book at home, I'm like, oh, a new book. And my family's like, yay, a new book. And then, I'm sitting there, like, as I'm looking through it, it's like a guy watching a football game, like at the last quarter, and it's like close neck and neck. I'm like, oh my gosh, I've been waiting for this information. It's got this and this. And they're like, okay, Mom. I get very excited about my research. And then so I pretty much, put it all in notebooks as I'm reading it. And then I do like to travel to the country that I'm writing about and just kind of connect those pieces. And they have like this wonderful tour company called Tours by Locals. And I've hired them for the last 3 countries that I have visited for research. And it's been just such an integral part of my research to get to find somebody who's also passionate about World War II and can really sort of pull back the veil on some things that maybe I wasn't entirely certain on, or maybe things that I didn't even know, which is always really exciting.
Oh, that's really cool. I have not heard any other author talk about that company hiring locals to get a tour of a place. I love that idea.
Yes, and it's personal. So usually what they'll do is they'll actually, I'll say, oh, I want to learn this, 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 and this. And at that point, I've done a lot of research, and I've actually had several tour guides that are like, you actually know more than me, I think, at this point. So you may want to go to somebody else. but I've always found somebody who can do everything that I need them to, and they will build an entire tour schedule for me. So when I was actually in Warsaw a couple months ago, we had 5 different tours, and they lasted anywhere from 8 to 16 hours a day.
Wow.
Yeah, it was amazing.
For the Librarian Spy specifically, do you remember the first time you heard about these American librarians working as spies? How did you stumble across this story?
Yes. I was just, history nerd here. I was just reading through history articles, you know how it goes. And I happened upon this one article that was talking about the librarian spies and how they were sent over to places like Lisbon, Portugal, and how they really didn't receive a lot of training when they were sent over there. And to be honest with you, that was kind of the part that stuck out to me as like, that would be a really interesting story. Because as much as I would love to think that like I would be a really great spy, I would not, because my ankles pop and I can't really keep a good secret for too long. I am horrible at lying. I like start blushing and everything. So I probably would be sort of like Ava's character, where she was, sent over to Lisbon. And for people who may not be familiar with it, in Lisbon, Portugal, that's actually where Ian Fleming received his inspiration for his 007 book, the Casino Royale. Mm-hmm. So you can imagine like these spies, these consummate spies that are so slick and so smooth, and they're doing everything that they should. And then here's this like poor librarian coming in, kind of like thrown to the wolves, so to speak. And I thought, that would be a really interesting story, because I could see myself in her shoes.
Oh, definitely. I would have been the worst at that, because I'm such an over planner. Going in without much training, I'd be like, this is ridiculous.
I know. And then I'd be like, what plan B? I didn't even have a plan A. This is driving me crazy.
When researching the Librarian Spy, did you have any favorite resources?
Well, I mean, the travel was pretty amazing. Yeah, I went to Lyon, France for a week. And so the interesting thing is I actually did this during the pandemic. So France had opened up, but Portugal was still closed. And so initially I was kind of wanting to do both trips at the same time, as would be more cost effective. But when France opened up, I thought, let me just go on ahead and take advantage of this opportunity and go now. So I went to Lyon, France. I went with my my oldest daughter, and we spent about a week there. And then later on, when Portugal opened, France actually closed. So I'm very glad that I ended up not waiting. So then I went to Lisbon, Portugal with my husband. And then actually, like about a couple of weeks later, I even went to Washington, D.C., and I got to go to the Library of Congress and see that. So, I mean, it was just so incredible. I mean, I love travel anyways, but especially after having taken so many months to learn so much about the culture, the people, the history, just everything about where I'm traveling to, and going there and getting to see it all in real life and taste the food and smell the smells and just experience all of it. I mean, it really just was absolutely incredible.
Since you mentioned the notebooks of research that you have and that you can never include it all, I have to ask, is there anything that you wish you had included or had been able to include in the Librarian Spy that you weren't able to or had to cut for some reason?
Yes, and I actually do mention it in the author's note, but so this will be kind of a spoiler alert for people who read the author's note. Sorry, but so there was a man named Sousa Mendes was in Bordeaux, and he was a Portuguese diplomat, and they told him, do not sign any more visas whatsoever. No more French Jewish refugees can come into Portugal. And so he went against he went with his conscience and against what Salazar had told him to do. And he signed thousands of visas. In fact, as he was signing them, he was doing them so quickly that only his last name made it through a lot of them. It just said Mendes. And so all of those refugees were able to flee France and go to the safety of Portugal, or the relative safety, where they were able to hopefully go to somewhere else. So now they actually have something called the Sousa Mendes Foundation, where there are tens of thousands of people. These are all the descendants of the people who were saved by Sousa Mendes. And when he died, he actually died in abject poverty for this decision that he made, because he never recovered from it politically. And so I do mention that in the back of my book, in the author's note, because technically this occurred like 2 years prior to my book taking place. And I tried so hard to find a really great place to fit it in, but there really was no like smooth way to transition into, 2 years ago, this guy named Sousa Mendez, and so that's why, but he was so worthy of being mentioned that I wanted to make sure I at least was able to do that in my author's note. But there's just tons and tons and tons of information that I wish that I could have included in there as well. But unfortunately,
that's an incredible story. I got chills thinking about all of the descendants that.
Yeah, it really is incredible.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story.
Thank you.
And I always admire authors speaking about the books that are coming out right now, because I know you've been researching and writing at least one other book since then, and probably your brain is there instead of here. It almost seems like you would need a refresher to talk about the current book that's coming out.
Yes. Yeah, especially if I ever do if I do a book club or something and they talk about the last bookshop in London, and I'm like, oh my gosh, that was 4 countries ago. But yeah. So right now I'm actually just finishing up the edits, my personal edits, before I turn my book into my editor. So I'm actually in the middle of deadline right now. So I apologize if my brain is kind of scattered. It's, how it is when it gets to the end of deadline. It's I've been working 18-hour days and my brain is leaking out of my ears.
This is always my favorite question, but I'm especially interested to hear your perspective given the number of novels you've published. What advice do you have for writers, either those who are newly published or those hoping to land an agent or publishing contract?
I think just never stop learning. There are so many different workshops that you can take out there. There are so many different instructors you can take out there. And there are so many tiered levels as well. If you get to the point where you're I've taken all of the classes, start looking at one-on-one that you can do. For example, next year I'm hoping to do something with Lisa Cron, who writes a book called Story Genius that I absolutely love. And so, there's always ways that we can always continue to improve our writing, improve our craft. So just don't ever stop learning.
Everyone knows authors always have the best book recommendations. So I have to ask you what books you've enjoyed lately.
Well, right now I'm actually reading Mad Honey, the new book by Jodi Picoult, and it is so good. I'm actually listening to it. It's when I'm taking my breaks from doing my personal edits. It's really, really good. I also just finished reading Gabriella Saab's new book, Daughters of Victory, which is really good. She wrote The Last Checkmate. That was her debut last year, and it was so good also. And also Renee Rosen has one coming out soon called The Fifth Avenue Glamour Girl, about the life of Estee Lauder. And I didn't know anything about the life of Estee Lauder. I'm actually I wear makeup, but I'm not a super huge know everything about makeup kind of person. And the story was really fascinating. So those are some that I definitely have been enjoying.
Renee Rosen is a fellow Chicagoan, so I have been following her career for a while. I'm very excited about her next book too.
Oh, it's so good. You're going to love it. And that cover is gorgeous.
Okay.
Yes. And my word for finishing this book, finishing writing this book, is Hester, the new book that just came out. I can't wait. It's sitting on my dining room table, just looking at me you're almost done. I can't wait.
Your little reward at the end.
Yes, exactly.
Of course, I want to share how people can find you. What is your website and where do you like to hang out on social media?
So my website is madelinemartin.com, and I'm usually on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. Really, I'm on pretty much all of them. You can just type Madeline Martin author for Facebook. For Instagram and Twitter, it's at Madeline M. Martin, because somebody beat me to the punch with Madeline Martin. I know, right? Do you hate when that happens? And then it's do I make it Madeline dot? I mean, it's so Madeline M. Martin.
Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we haven't covered yet?
I think I totally forgot to mention the book that I'm working on right now, so I'll just mention the actual title. It's called The Keeper of Hidden Books, and it's actually about the librarians. I know I've got this thing going on with like books and librarians. I can't help myself. But it's about the librarians in Warsaw, Poland, who were fighting to make sure that they were saving books from being destroyed from Nazis and making sure that people still had books to read, even though libraries were closed down. So I've really been enjoying writing that one, and I'm super excited for it. And it comes out August 1st next year.
Oh, it'll be here before we know it.
I know.
The thread of like book theme or library theme or book lover theme throughout your historical fiction novels. I think they're like the perfect historical fiction for book lovers. It's like
I couldn't agree more. But of course, I love books, so
and readers love books too, so it seems perfect. Well, Madeline, it was such a pleasure chatting with you today. I cannot thank you enough for coming on this podcast and sharing a bit about your books and your background.
It was my pleasure, Ashley. Thank you so much for having me.